First of all, welcome. I'm really very happy to see here some familiar faces, some new faces. Happy to see you all today and to have the honor of moderating this panel on building resilience against foreign covert influences through open government. My name is Kristen Sample. I'm the Director of Governance at the National Democratic Institute. And this is a panel that's been co-organized by NDI, along with our partners, Transparency International, and the Open Government Partnership. As you can see today, we have a very esteemed crew here of panelists. I'm going to have a chance in a minute to introduce them to you and to talk a little bit about the format and the topics that each of them will be speaking on. But before I do that, as moderator, I just wanted to take a minute or two to kind of set the scene on why we think this topic is so important. And I guess we'd start by saying, again, we're focusing here on open government and transparency as resilience measures against foreign covert influences. And I guess if we think back when, for instance, Open Government Partnership was created in 2011, it's been 11 years now, the world has changed in a lot of important ways, and or at least there are new issues that are on the radar now that we need to be aware of and looking at ways to adapt to and to counter. So again, if we look back 10 or 11 years, the situation has changed. If we, it's much evidence, much documented. For instance, there's been some democratic decline. A larger percentage of the world, unfortunately, is living now under authoritarian context. The figure in 2011 was 43%. It's now 20%, according to Varieties of Democracy. Last year, unfortunately, we saw a record number of coups around the world. It was in 2021, it was 6 coups, and of course, we've seen increasing levels of polarization. But another very notable shift, of course, has been as well the increasingly bold and transgressive influence that autocratic governments, again, so there's more autocratic governments, and they're more aggressive in terms of interfering in many cases in democratic societies. Of course, the kind of the signature, the flagship case of this sort of transgressive influence is what we've been seeing from Russia and their unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine beginning in February. So it's an extreme example, but it's not the only example. We are seeing, like Ukraine, that again, taking the OGP world, other OGP member countries around the world find themselves under assault from foreign covert actors seeking to influence their political processes, shift their public discourse, and gain access to their economic and strategic resources. Now, the tactics may vary, of course, but one through line that we find is opacity. These foreign-sponsored schemes that subvert a country's democratic process are unpopular, they're often illegal. So the illiberal actors take great pains, take great care to shield their activities from public scrutiny, relying on covert tools like confidentiality clauses, proxy donors, or shell companies. So all of these threats require sort of new efforts, new and adapted efforts to build resilience and to uphold democratic principles. And we believe what we're finding in our research is that when well-designed and consistently implemented and enforced, transparency measures can be an effective counterpoint to foreign-sponsored illiberal influences. The transparency measures can represent something of a gateway reform, right? There's already consensus around them. They help to, again, to unmask the influences that are coming in and to build broad public consensus around the need for reform and increased democratic defense and resilience. So against this backdrop, OGP and NDI, and in partnership with TI, we've produced a series of policy briefs. Happy to share those with you after the session. You can find some of them as well on the tables that are very much focused, again, on specific openness and oversight measures that build resilience against covert foreign-sponsored influences. We've sort of framed them, again, for OGP members, but they're really openness measures that could be adopted or considered by any democratic government that, again, is seeking to boost its resilience to any sort of foreign covert influence. This is a very complex topic. It's a very sensitive topic. Luckily, we have, as I said, an esteemed panel here to help us kind of navigate through the issues. What we've done today is we're going to be calling on 3 thematic experts, expert panelists who are going to talk on 3 areas of vulnerability when it comes to foreign covert influence. So first we have Rueben Lifuka. He's going to speak to us on opaque debt. As many of you probably know, Rueben is the vice chair of this conference, his council, the IACC. He's also vice chair of Transparency International's advisory board, and he was president of TI Zambia from 2000 to 2012, and then reelected in 2017. So Rueben will speak for about 10 minutes or so on the topic of opaque debt. Then we're going to have Solvita Denisa, Dr. Solvita Denisa, who's the principal media literacy advisor at the Baltic Center for Media Excellence, speak on the topic of information manipulation. And the third thematic speaker will be Jorge Valladares. He'll be speaking on covert political finance. Jorge is the political integrity policy lead at the TI Secretariat, and he's also worked at International IDEA, both as the head of political parties as well as the head of mission to Myanmar. Following the 3 thematic presentations, we'll be hearing from Joseph Foti from Open Government Partnership, and he's going to kind of take those thematic issues and kind of walk us through a little bit about how open government processes have addressed those issues, maybe how they haven't addressed them, and how they could do more in the future. And for those of you who don't know Joe yet, he's the Chief Research Officer at OGP, and he leads the Analytics and Insights team. We'll have these presentations, and then what we're hoping to do is leave time for discussion and maybe even do a little breakout, which is a little unorthodox here perhaps, but maybe even find a way that we could have each of our experts meet with folks according to the topics that you're interested in for about 10 or 15 minutes to brainstorm on some key measures. And then in the final plenary, we would be able to share what those key insights are or recommendations that are coming out. So without any further ado or intro from my side, I'm going to hand it over to Rueben then to talk first on this issue of opaque debt. What are the patterns of influence? How do we see this playing out? And perhaps what are some potential lessons or measures that could be considered? Rueben.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and it's a pleasure being here. I'm passionate about the issue of opaque data and debt transparency, not from an economist's point of view, but mainly from a governance point of view. And I'm a Zambian, so I've been associated with Transparency International in Zambia and globally for more than 20 years. And in recent studies on opaque debts, 3 countries will usually come up for special mention: Mozambique, Zambia, and Chad. So I'll use a Zambian case study just to illustrate the challenges of opaque debt, but also link this to the need for reforms from a governance, transparency, and accountability perspective. Zambia, at the end of 2021, had a public debt estimated to stand at $31.7 billion. Clearly, this is a country that's under debt stress, and several stakeholders have raised concerns about the unsustainability of this public debt. Zambia is a resource-rich country with a lot of minerals, etc. Now, as of 2022, mid-2022, the public debt has gone down to $27 billion because of some repayments that have been made. But civil society, through different structures such as the CSO Debt Alliance, have been consistent in advocating for greater transparency in the manner that debt is procured, debt is reported, but also how debt is utilized. We've had a change of government. The government came in August 2021, and the new government made it a priority to restructure the public debt because it's just unsustainable. And because it was unsustainable, the previous administration defaulted on external debt payment in 2020. Now, how does government go about restructuring this public debt? They've turned to the IMF, seeking a $1.3 billion assistance package. However, this package was contingent on the debt, official bilateral creditors agreeing to negotiate a debt restructuring deal with Zambia. And you see that that is where the problems now begin. In order to negotiate this debt restructuring and unlock the IMF package, government has had to go back to the official creditors. Now, how much public debt needs to be restructured? It's about $17.3 billion. And according to the Minister of Finance in Zambia, the official bilateral creditors account for 15% of public debt. The multilateral financial institutions about 11.5%. And we had 3 Eurobond investors, and their debt stands at 11.7%. And the non-bonded commercial lenders at 11.4%. Now, the big elephant in the room for Zambia has been Chinese debt. It is estimated at $6 billion. In fact, now others say $6.6 billion is owed to Chinese commercial and state-owned lenders. So this is the largest creditor group by nationality, and it gives China significant leverage in Zambia's ability to restructure its debt. And over the years, there's been contention over the debt owed to Chinese commercial and state-owned lenders. And some studies that were conducted after the change of government, in fact, suggest that Zambia's debt to Chinese public and private lenders was almost double the amount disclosed by the previous government. So clearly, one of the problems that Zambia and several other countries, especially the low-income developing countries, face is this opacity of debt. The uncertainty about the debt numbers, debt coverage, also compounded by weak debt management frameworks, which are also associated with reporting lags, have always led to this speculation about public debt levels. The World Bank, in its report of 2021 entitled Debt Transparency in Developing Economies, highlights that 40% of the low-income developing countries have not published any sovereign debt data in the last 2 years. So it now raises for me the question, so what is opaque debt? Whilst the whole concept of opaque debt is very broad, it's essentially defined as non-transparent lending and borrowing. That is done in such a way that the funds are unable to be tracked, and neither government nor lenders can be held accountable for their financial decisions. And that is where the interest for me as an anti-corruption practitioner comes in, that we cannot hold government and lenders accountable for the financial decisions. So opaque debt includes debt that is simply not reported or incompletely reported or kept from exposure because of the inclusion of confidentiality clauses in the loan agreements or the non-market domestic issuance. Now, opaque debt has also included non-marketable loans such as those that are resource-backed debt. That is when governments borrow against future resource derivative revenue streams. And we've seen that this has been growing over the years. But this opaque debt is a global problem, and there is no region that has been left untouched. Of concern to countries like Zambia is after the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a significant increase in state borrowing. And we've also seen an increase in opaque debt as governments have sought fresh revenues in order to meet the COVID-19 challenge. Mozambique always comes up for special mention, and this is well documented. In 2016, it was discovered that the government of Mozambique had borrowed but did not disclose 2 loans totaling $1.1 billion. And this was roughly 9% of GDP at the time. Ecuador has also been found to have kept debt equal to the same percentage of GDP of its official debt statistics. Greece was condemned in 2010 for providing false data as to the state of its finances. Just like Togo in Africa was found to have failed to report debt equivalent to 7% of GDP. But what are the implications, therefore, of opaque debt? There are several. Firstly, by its very nature, the opaque debt creates increased opportunities for corruption. Zambia got 3 Eurobonds, and if you really ask the people in government what we use the Eurobonds for, no one can tell you what they did with the money. For instance, one of the Eurobonds was supposed to be used to rehabilitate the infrastructure for the public rail system. As we speak, the rail system is not really functioning. But money was obtained purportedly to be plowed into the resuscitation of the public rail system. So opaque debt creates opportunities for corruption. And if you note, the countries that have a lot of opaque debt are the ones that do poorly on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. Secondly, because of opaque debt, the ability of the executive branch of government and its agencies and institutions is strengthened. So the executive makes a decision, and this is at the expense of oversight functions of the legislators, who are often kept in the dark as to the true state of the country's finances. So we see a weakening of checks and balances. Like I was saying about Chinese debt, in Zambia, just like in other places, Chinese loans typically have confidentiality clauses, meaning the terms cannot be disclosed by countries to the public or to other creditors. Neither Chinese creditors nor their sovereign debtors normally disclose the text of their loan agreements. So in the Zambian case, not even the parliament knew the full extent of the Chinese loan agreements. But we also have lending by private creditors whose share of foreign debts is growing and it has nearly doubled, but they also lack sufficient transparency safeguards. So the executive then make most of the decisions to the detriment of the oversight function of parliament. But also, opaque debt violates the principle of the right to information. The right to information which the legislators need, but also civil society who should have this access to information to hold governments accountable, but also other lenders and the public at large. Opaque debt equally has an impact when you talk about debt restructuring. Like I said, Zambia had to, the IMF required Zambia to strike a debt restructuring deal with its official bilateral creditors. But the official bilateral creditors wanted to also know, what do you owe China? You cannot ask us to restructure debt when we do not know what you owe China and on what terms. So debt relief becomes a challenge. Debt restructuring negotiations become protracted when creditors raise doubt about the size and composition of the debtor's debt portfolio, or they find it difficult to assess the level of debt relief that is needed to restore the debt sustainability. Quite often, and we've seen this in the Zambian case, where creditors also seek to avoid subsidizing other creditors whose debt has not been officially disclosed. So then what is the solution to this? Debt transparency becomes an important public policy solution. And if you read about debt transparency and really analyze what is happening around debt transparency, it's essentially about ensuring availability of debt data and borrowing processes that are legitimate, that are rule-based and traceable. The borrowers and creditors need detailed information on outstanding stock of public debt, including terms and conditions. And the borrowers and creditors will need this so that they can make informed borrowing and lending decisions. But also, citizens need this information to hold their governments accountable. So debt transparency allows for more accurate assessment of risks for investment decisions, among others. So, but then one would ask, what would be the role of Parliament if we were to look at the role of Parliament? And maybe before I even talk about that, when you're talking about debt transparency, you want to see transparency in debt reporting. So your debt reports should be comprehensive, timely, but also provide consistent information at the public level. And you also want to see transparency in the borrowing operations, so around the borrowing practices. Ensure that the debt is contracted legitimately and it is shielded from undue political interference. And talking about this, I have two more points and then I end, Christine. We've seen, like in the Zambian case, where again, because of the need for infrastructure development, we've had contractors mobilizing resources. So we have what are known as contractor-initiated facilities. So not only is the contractor mobilizing resources, they are also the contractor, the designer, the contractor, and they implement the project before handing it over to government. The problem with contractor-initiated facilities is that quite often these are projects that are not priority for government, but because the contractor has links through corruption with people in government, projects are undertaken even when they're not necessary. So this transparency in borrowing operations is important so that people know that the data has been contracted legitimately and the necessary financial costs and risks of the borrowing have been conducted. Let me end with the roles that I see for different stakeholders. Parliaments, of course, are an important actor in any debt management situation. And Parliament plays two roles: the legislative role, ensuring that you have the right legal framework for debt management, the adoption of fiscal rules, ratification of loan agreements, among others. But Parliament also plays this oversight role to ensure that the spending of government, even from the public debt that has been acquired, the spending can be scrutinized and ensure that monies have gone in the right places. But civil society is an important actor in advocating for greater transparency, but also using the information which is available to monitor implementation and advocate for necessary changes. The media is definitely important in reporting on dates and translating technical matters into information that is accessible to the wider audience. Let me end here for now. There are a few recommendations one would make, but of course we can speak to that. We just need to have legal frameworks for public borrow which are transparent, which promote transparency and have clear positions on oversight. We need to have the publishing of information on terms and conditions of loan agreements, and this information should be available to Parliament and public citizens at large. I'll end here for now. Thank you.
That was great. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Rueben. You know, when you lay out the case, to me, it just seems so compelling, and I'm always amazed and somewhat dismayed by the limited attention that I think this agenda gets of opaque debt. As you've laid out, it's a corruption risk, it's a violation of right to information, it's undermines checks and balances in a country, and of course, as we all know, it creates unsustainable levels of debt that end up, obviously, it's the citizens who have to pay that debt back, and we see all these austerity and these cuts to budgets. This one statistic that has always stuck with me is that of the 25 poorest countries in the world, 21 of the 25 poorest countries in the world pay more on debt service payments out of the budget than they do on health, education, and social services combined. So it's just this huge vacuum of public resources that countries get caught in a spiral of because, again, the loans are taken up without parliamentary scrutiny and sometimes without being disclosed at all. So thanks again for those remarks from the Zambian and the global perspective. So I'm going to ask Solvita now to talk to us a little bit about the threats and some lessons when it comes to information manipulation, especially foreign-sponsored. Solvita.
Thank you. I've spent the last decade dealing with three main profiles. The first profile is content. So I try to figure out the main general dominant manipulative techniques used by authoritarian regimes, mainly in Russian language. This is my native language. The second profile, audiences. For different clients, I try to understand the impact of these manipulative techniques on different targeted audiences. It is a very difficult profile when you have to understand how to measure this impact, when you have to go a step back and you have to understand the input, then you have to go through proceeding. So how information is being processed by someone. And the third profile is governmental response. So I was focused mainly on the level of Baltic countries, the Baltic states, on governmental response towards or against disinformation. And the fourth one is resilience. So how to design projects to address threats and challenges we see. And the main challenge I want to address today is that dealing with information manipulations, dealing with information environment, it seems, and I want to underline, it seems, that we are too news-centric and we are too media news-centric. And now I know that it is a little bit tricky, but I will ask you to close your eyes. And it is tricky because those who are jet lagging, so I'll try to increase my voice. Yeah, but please close your eyes, I'll do it as well. So, and imagine yourself in your apartments after a very difficult day. So you are finally at your home, at your place. Try to imagine the place you are relaxing. I do not want to force you, but maybe it's a couch or a chair. And now, please open your eyes. So, was it an environment you are using news? Or you were relaxing with a book, with friends? Maybe it was TV or some gadgets and you were watching Netflix or some series. And now, without closing your eyes, please imagine your neighbor. Maybe your neighbor is not so well educated, very hardworking, have a lot of kids, as I do. And just imagine this evening at their family, and what do they do? Is it YouTube and cartoons and animation, or is it international news channel? And when I'm working with governments, when I'm working with international organizations, it seems that somehow this soft content or entertainment-related content is not seen in monitorings, is somehow left aside. And I think that this is a problem. And now let me bring one case of the use of entertainment in one authoritarian regime. And now we are back to 2004. In 2004, on one of Russian TV channels, one beautiful sitcom, humor-based, was presented for the first time. So 2004, a series called Soldati, Soldiers. Super popular content. Just imagine, 17 seasons. Huge amount of series. And the main idea is to show Russian army. To show Russian army as something, very good, actually. And you can imagine those who are dealing with information and media and those who are just, trying to figure out the target audience of sitcoms, humor-based comedies, and serious. So it's basically female. And you can imagine that this idea of perfect, friendly, actually very friendly Russian army has been transmitted since 2004 to Russian female. But why I decided to bring this example? Because this is not only a story about army. This is also a story with elements increasing tolerance towards corruption. Because two heroes in these in many episodes are representing corruption in army. And this corruption is so tiny, so it's like to steal, something small, or it is like to use soldiers for personal benefit, so to help with the garden-related works, or etc., etc. And now, for those, I can check, actually. I can check how many of you are good in Russian language. I will pronounce two surnames. And please help other people from audience to figure out their nationality. So these two corruptive heroes in this comedy are Shmatko and Daniluk. Both Ukrainians. Thank you so much. So not the episodes only, but the serial or this project was banned in Ukraine in 2014 or in 2015. But we can find a lot of beautiful examples very similar to this one. And going back to Ukraine, so the first weeks of Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So maybe you know that Latvia and the other Baltic countries, we were very busy helping Ukraine as a kind of, first responders. But internally, we also were dealing with something very strange. So yesterday, NDIU had a awarding ceremony. But you can also imagine that in Latvia, we try to get awards back. Because somehow we understood, finally, that these awards are now related to people seen in actually similar rooms with Putin in the last days of February when he met businessmen and so on. So you referred to China, and I'll quickly go back now to figure out, so based on these 4 profiles, what occupies my mind. And I truly believe that corruption is a matter of national security. And that's why, when we are dealing with national security, we have to understand what is on agenda of authoritarian regimes when we are dealing with national security. And it is quite easy to figure out that in China and in Russia, there is a similar pattern. And the similar pattern could be called differently, but the main idea is cognitive superiority. And when we are talking about cognitive superiority, we are talking about the same information domain, but we are strengthening some different issues. So when we are dividing informational domain into 3 parts, we have one, which is gadget-centric or physical-centric. The second is data-centric, and this is how we want to control media or to control landscapes, etc. The third one is human-centric. And when we are talking about this human-centric domain, we are talking about values, we are talking about beliefs, we are talking about identities and ideologies. And let me use not my definition of cognitive superiority, but the definition provided by Harley and Jobson. Cognitive superiority is domination over diplomatic, informational, military, and economic domains of warfare. As emerging conflict take place in the cognitive domain, the man is described by the authors as bio, so biological, psycho, psychological, socio, so this is how we communicate. Then it is techno, so we are communicating by using gadgets, and info, being. So there are many layers. And when we are talking about resilience and building resilience, we have to address each of these layers. And when we are talking about possibilities to influence, we also have to address these very different layers. So I still have 3 minutes, am I right? 1. Okay, so for 1 minute, what we have to do. So I think the only option for us is cross-sectoral cooperation. We need to empower not only journalists, we need to empower society. And I truly believe that with corruption is the same as media literacy. You should start talking about these issues in kindergarten. So university, it's too late. School, it is too late. Because we see that it is so influential. And why this cross-sectoral cooperation is important. 2 beautiful reports. One is on a level of increasing depression of those who understand that governments are corruptive. So if you will have interest, I can share this data later with you, but the idea is, so if you have these citizens, and citizens think that the government is corruptive, and he lives in this environment, the level of his depression is correlated and could increase. So that's why it is important to understand how it works. So it is not only, the idea of taking document and working with documents. We have to get ourselves into MRI apparatus and understand how do we respond to corruption. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Solvita. I think the example that you gave, that entertainment example, is so interesting, and it really does illustrate, as you were saying, the need for a very holistic or a whole of society approach, because these patterns are so insidious and so covert and so subliminal sometimes that it's not easy to come up with policy responses. And so also, of course, combining it with civic education, media literacy, and a whole host of different responses, I think, is absolutely essential. So thank you for sharing that. Now we're going to go on to sort of the third tactic, the third sort of strategy that we're focusing on in terms of foreign-sponsored corruptive influences, and that's political finance corruption. Jorge, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this panel of very distinguished speakers. And also, I should, just for full disclaimer, I should acknowledge that I feel not only intimidated by my fellow speakers, but also by the presence of two very prominent political finance speakers in the room, Magnus Olmans and Delia Ferreira, whom, I mean, yes, I'll bow to you and try to do my best explaining something that is as old, but perhaps also has adopted new forms that may also present challenges for you to grasp with as topics. And what I wanted to present here as a problem, and perhaps elaborate a little bit on the potential impacts, is the issue of covert foreign political finance. What do I mean by this? I basically mean the funding of political parties, candidates, their committees, other third parties that take part in electoral processes or political processes, also well-connected elites or public officials, or other political influential groups in society who accept financial incentives in kind or in cash through non-transparent structures. Why is this a problem? By one account, over the last 10 years, or between 2010 and 2020, this form of foreign political financing represented about $300 million in about 33 countries, and it happened about 100 times in elections, influencing public discourse, etc. So it is probably a problem that we see better now, but it has already existed with us for several years. I've been socialized into democratic activism or political activism with people who used to be political leaders in the 50s, 60s, and would tell me very openly that the way they got their money was by traveling in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, etc., and just collect money or make contacts to get that kind of political financing to be able to start a revolution, start a political party, or something like that. So what's come to, why is it new today, or why is it important for us, is that I think the context that Kristen provided at the beginning is perhaps the best way to understand this. This is now used, in a different context. At least 10 years ago, we were at the peak of a democratization wave, or having more countries being democratic than ever before. And at that moment, we started a decade of backsliding, of course, due to several factors, but one of them, of course, was the activism of authoritarian regimes using this strategic corruption, advancing corruptive interests, and doing it by co-opting political parties, politicians, public discourse in democratic countries to advance their own interests, country or national interests. So I think it's a moment for us to rethink how we see the tools that are at our disposal in regulating and enforcing political finance regulations to curb this. Why? Because most of this influencing or this foreign political financing uses or seizes on the vulnerabilities of democratic regimes. With democratic regimes tend to be open, political financing or donations are forms of political speech. They are widely incentivized, but at the same time, our regimes now, I mean most democratic countries, allow for several ways of influencing electoral outcomes that are not entirely regulated. 2 or 3 of these forms are, for instance, the role of third parties in election campaigns. Organizations like my own, or many of yours, I'm sure, actively participate during election campaigns, advancing specific issues, and you do it without reporting anything to the oversight agency or the election commission about these expenditures. Because in most countries, we do not have any regulation related to the disclosure of these expenses by groups that are not political parties or support candidates. Second, our own rules tend to allow for legal entities with foreign ownership to also be part of this, and our definitions of what is foreign are very much anchored in something very distant, but do not take into account the complexities of tax or ownership structures that may allow for this. So several of these vulnerabilities or distinct features of our political finance regimes are, of course, loopholes through which these forms of foreign political influencing actually happen through financing. Why is this bad? I mean, I'm sure we can go on for this, but of course, this is a form of corruption. They circumvent the law. It particularly targets those actors in political processes that support or advance extremist views or views that are meant to destabilize the political or the extremes, to put it in a different way, systematically. It produces an individual political benefit in detriment of the overall collective political process. So, and this has happened not only initiated by Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, but we also see it at different scale, but in other regions, such as in Latin America. I mean, I see the director of TI Venezuela, Merche de Freitas. Venezuela, I mean, at least during the last decade, was involved in several cases, the Venezuelan government, in several cases like the Valija Gate in Argentina, or the financing of presidential candidate in my own country, but also in Nicaragua and many others as such. And of course, Russian interference doesn't only happen in this country, but also in countries such as Bolivia and others. So the issue is relevant. And it's not only relevant, but also poses an additional challenge, because we do accept other forms of foreign, I don't want to call it interference, but foreign aid in democratic processes. Democracy support is a very well accepted, widespread form of participation of foreign governments into domestic political processes. So going about tackling this issue poses several challenges, not only because it invite us to redefine the rules, the definitions of what we consider foreign, what we consider interference, but also because in going about this, it may also pose some challenges to basic freedoms that we have in our societies, such as the participation of non-contestant groups or third parties, such as NGOs, in the context of election campaigns. One example of this is Ireland, where the issue of the foreign financing of in elections was tackled by forcing to every announcer or advertiser in the context of an election campaign to disclose, to first of all have a cap, a limit for advertising, but also to disclose their income. That resulted in NGOs such as our chapter in Ireland not to be, allowed to do advocacy on issues that they consider essential to be taken into account in the context of an election campaign, but also being forced to disclose with unnecessary burden their sources of income. So I think I always wanted to put the problem, but let me just finish by saying that perhaps part of the solution is insisting on disclosure, which is the low-hanging fruit, and is the, perhaps, to call it one way, the do not harm approach. Of course, we need to reconsider how we go about reporting contacts with foreign agents or representatives of foreign powers. How do we go about regulating the information ecosystem in our countries? But disclosure may help to do it. And in some cases, we don't even need to create new regulations, but we probably just need to start or implementing what exists already, but is not implemented, sorry, yet. But also giving oversight agencies the mandates and the legitimacy to be more proactive in their in their implementation. For instance, most countries ban foreign donations already, more than 2/3 of the countries around the world. But then the definition of foreign is not very well defined. So we still allow other companies, being the conduit for these donations. Most countries ban anonymous donations, but still we allow, in certain cases, legal forms that allow for disguising the real donors, or beneficiary owners, or other individuals do these donations to these straw donors or third parties as well. So I believe in the second part of this workshop we are going to discuss some of the solutions. You will find a few suggestions in the brief that is available in the tables around you, where we've come up with some of this kind of creative thinking about how to go about the issue of curbing foreign political financing without creating excessive restrictions to the freedoms that should, of course, operate in the context of an election campaign and political discourse in general.
Thank you so much, Jorge. That was really great. I really like how you start out by explaining this paradox, right? That it's actually that these autocratic governments are able to weaponize the very openness, the very free speech that's present, that kind of underlies the principles of democratic societies, and they're able to weaponize that to increase their influence in those societies. Also appreciated your reference to the need to distinguish, I think, very clearly between what democratic support is, transparent democratic support and solidarity, versus, again, the covert types of influence that are addressed in the brief that you mentioned. So we've seen, again, these three different types of tactics. So foreign corruptive influence, again, opacity seems to be a through line. Joe is going to help us kind of tie it all together and better understand how transparency and oversight and OGP perhaps particularly could be a way to also build the resilience against these foreign types of corruption, maybe what some of the lessons are or kind of the gaps and areas that we need to move forward on. So, Joe.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Kristen and to NDI and others. And I do encourage everyone to look at the briefs that are on the tables here. So when OGP was founded and launched in 2011, one of the peculiar things about it is that the word democracy didn't appear in any of the documents that were launched there. And it turns out that that was actually intentional. In later interviews with Jorge Valladares from Brazil and with Jeremy Weinstein, two of the founders, they specifically referenced that open government was a way of talking about democracy without talking about democracy. As Kristen pointed out at the beginning, though, we don't have that luxury anymore, as our democracies are under continued threat. So over the time, OGP has needed to very much focus energy on reinforcing political integrity and being much more explicit about supporting civil liberties, civil rights, and encouraging better countering illiberal influences, both from foreign and within. So for those of you who don't know, the Open Government Partnership is 11 years old, started with 12 countries, has grown to 77. There is a governments make 2-year action plans co-created with civil society, and those are evaluated by an independent reporting mechanism. So how have these 3 topics done in OGP so far? Not as well as we would hope. So we all have work ahead of us. With regard to debt, the commitments have been few and far between. On the plus side, what you do have is you have massive numbers of fiscal commitments in OGP, people working on open budgets, people working on other tax issues, but not as much as we'd like to see in debt. There are examples. Sierra Leone did work on centralizing all of its treasury accounts as part of its OGP action plan, and you have some less successful issues like Liberia having a digital debt clock like the one in New York, which wasn't as helpful. So these, again, are too rare. Information manipulation is an area that's been growing, and in the last few years we have seen more and more commitments. Most specifically, the Dutch government has been using OGP and various EU processes to advance discussions about how you do this without cutting into civil liberties. On political finance, we've seen many more commitments. So in this, out of all of our membership, you do have 13 countries which have worked on political finance transparency. Less so on the foreign agents or foreign influence issue, but generally on political party finance. There's a fourth shadow issue which everyone has alluded to, which is absolutely essential, and again, not as many commitments have we seen as we would like, and that's the area of civil liberties or civic space, and that's important for 2 reasons. Both when we put these types of commitments into place, especially around finance and especially around disinformation, we need to make sure that there's adequate safeguards and that you don't get copycat laws that end up being used to harass NGOs, which has very much happened, unfortunately, even among a membership organization like OGP, where we shouldn't have that. The second is that fundamentally you can't identify all this activity. Governments cannot do it themselves, so it needs to be as an enabler to detect where there are irregularities and these issues. So I don't want to give you an entirely depressing picture about what's going on in OGP. We know that certain things work in OGP. And so I think that when we have examples that work on getting good reforms, it's worth seeing. Hopefully we can come back, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. I think we just came back from our Africa meeting in Marrakesh, and the topic of debt was hot, hot, hot. So, so hopefully we see some good commitments on this issue. So what works? Well, we know that when we have an OGP process, and we can now show this mathematically with regressions and all that fancy stuff, that better participation matters. What do we mean here? We mean that our independent reporting mechanism finds that more ambitious commitments are in action plans when you have more civil society participation there, that model does work. We also know that they get done more often when you have ongoing public monitoring. So what does that mean for all of these issues is that we know that if we can get them into OGP processes, ideally they will work. So those of you who are working at the country level, I would encourage you to have either participate in those processes if these issues matter to you, but also to support other folks who are experts on these. And so a really positive example of where things work and catch fire in OGP in a good way is in 2013, the idea of having the public beneficial ownership registry was probably a wild idea, but at the OGP summit at the last minute, David Cameron announced that there would be that public beneficial ownership commitment. So now, 8 years later, 33 OGP countries have beneficial ownership transparency commitments in their OGP action plans. And it's not just that they have the commitments in their action plans. We now know that a third of the countries publish some beneficial ownership data in those countries. So that's tremendous progress in a fairly short amount of time. And it may be an exceptional case, but it's also not that exceptional. I could name other areas where that's happened. So I'm hoping that all of these issues, we can come back in 8 years and say that there's been serious progress on them. They're much more complex. And I'm not going to go out there and say all the beneficial ownership data is good. But that is big progress, and we know that it works. So with that, I'll just stop and hopefully encourage all of you to participate in your local planning process. There's one going on in the United States right now.
Thanks so much, Joe. That's really helpful, Joe. And I think that, given that these problems, as you said, are so complex and often require whole of society approaches, especially with information manipulation, OGP really is the perfect platform since it's multi-stakeholder and it brings together civil society and parliaments and government and local government in many cases to work together on these deep challenges. Given where we're at in terms of timing, what I'd like to do, I have loads of questions, but I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to give, I think what we're going to do now is have folks in the audience. We want this to be as interactive and really a dialogue. If folks would like to, I think we have a microphone maybe out there? No? I'm sorry. We would like to invite you. We'll take a round of maybe 3 or 4 brief, questions or observations so that the panelists can respond. And maybe if there's time, we could get through 1 or 2 of those rounds. Are you going to use this one? Okay. Okay. Do you mind if we share? Okay. And who would like to go first? Let's take Vincent, maybe over here, and then.
Thank you very much. Hello?
Do you want to use this one instead?
This one's
Number 4. I did it. Number 4 is on.
I'll switch it off.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne. I'm from Uganda. I am a deputy ombudsman in my country. Excellent choice of panelists. I'm glad that I determined this evening to be here and listen from all of you. My question is first a remark, and I want to thank very much Solvita and Joseph, who have alluded to public ownership in the fight against corruption. Many times we think that the fight against corruption should be in the boardrooms, should be in the conferences, should be with the parliamentarians, with the civic space. But I also think that as duty bearers, it's time that we change the strategy to include the public, to include the real victims of corruption, who are the day-to-day people whose rights that we aim at protecting. Many times we sit in conferences in boardrooms, we strategize, we make policies, we make rules and regulations. Pretty good thing for us to do, but then when it comes to implementation, it's the public that must understand that they're the victims of corruption, that corruption affects them. So I want us, in my country, that's what we're doing. We're trying to involve as much as possible the public ownership in the fight against corruption. In the earlier panel, a certain gentleman, I think it was Tim, alluded to local ownership, coming up with local ways of having the day-to-day local people, the day-to-day persons involved in the fight against corruption. Let us not only leave it to the civic space, to the parliamentarians, to the civil society or to international bodies, but involve the day-to-day person. We should have more aggressive means to fight corruption by involving the real victims of corruption and who are the people that we seek to protect. Solvita, is it possible at the international scene to change strategy from just having policies, rules, rule of law, implementing rule of law, but also strategize and have the day-to-day person having the victims of corruption on board? Is that possible? Thank you.
I'm Ana Gomes from TI Portugal. I've been a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of what you talked about. Parliamentarians, for instance, chosen to go to certify the referendum in Crimea, or to organize visits to Mugabe, well, and of course, in Europe we have Russian loans to extreme right-wing parties such as Marine Le Pen's in France and so on, and other European countries. But my question is to Ms. Solvita Liepniece about the media. What we are seeing, for instance, in my country is, and this is not new, actually, Angolan kleptocracy used that in Portugal. First thing that they bought was the media to ensure that they would control whatever was broadcasted in Portugal about Angola and therefore not replicated in Angola. Now we see, for instance, a major a Russian oligarch controlling one of our group media. We see the most pro-Russian in the narrative about the aggression against Ukraine in another group media, which is actually a franchise of CNN Portugal. They even had a reporter in Mariupol. When Mariupol was being destroyed by the Russians, they had a reporter filmed on the Russian side saying how terrible the Ukrainians were. And the generals who have been to the Valdai Club are given free space every day to foster that narrative. This is CNN Portugal. It was not by chance that they picked up an American media to actually replicate these outrageous narratives. So, and this is not even covered. It's very open.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Alexandra, I'm from Kyiv School of Economics in Ukraine. And since Ukraine was mentioned here many times, I would also like to say that In Ukraine, the OGP has been also a very, very taken on board initiative. Ukraine is one of the few countries where, for example, the beneficiary ownership registers are available as open data, and there is now another tool that is being built on top of this, which is like a commercial product that companies can use and so on. So it's possible. But also another thing which I would like to highlight with engagement, what I think OGP has started an impressive work, is OGP Local. Because this is a program that takes commitments for the local authorities for participation, transparency, and accountability. And this is really galvanizing the local democracy. And from what we see from the experience, because I'm a local government researcher, and I see now in the times of war, these connections that have been built through citizen participation and transparency at the local level in Ukraine, they help now resist the energy crisis, the migration, internal displacement crisis, and so on and so forth. So when we speak about open government, it's not only about democracy, but it's actually about resilience and national security and how we keep ourselves safe. So it's a very, I just wanted to comment on this. And my question is, I think, maybe you could speak about how in the open government framework, we could ensure more accountability also, because it's a lot about commitments and so on, but how do we make sure that they work, and how maybe international sanctions regimes can be like maybe merged with OGP or somehow in dialogue with it.
If you would pass the mic back to the woman there. I appreciate that you raised the local point, because the vulnerabilities to these foreign-sponsored corruptive influences are acute at national level, and I think they're even more challenging at local level. There's more vulnerability, less resources, less capacity, so it's great that you raised that. Question? Yes, the ownership question that we were hearing too.
To say that the inclusion, what you were raising, when we think of the people not as victims of corruption, but as the experts and sources of local knowledge how to tackle it, we empower them so much and we get really good results.
Thank you. This was a really amazing panel, so I thank all of you for your time and your presentations. I come from a long time in the correspondent banking world. As a leading AML investigator, I was a Standard Chartered for many years. I'm primarily in academia and research now. So my question is more for Rueben concerning Africa. I think the Chinese and Russia threat finance issue in terms of exploitation of the banking sector is a huge problem. In terms of China's data laws and the restriction of being able to see transparently into those relationships, I'm curious with their development into CBDC, blockchain technology, virtual currencies, and trying to expand in that space, which may actually block a lot of visibility within the correspondent banking world to understand what they're doing in conjunction with the Belt Road Initiative, how you see that shaping the response in Africa and how to kind of get around that, because it seems as they expand in that space, it's going to only compound the issue of corruption as opposed to make it easier to work around issues that Africa has been fighting historically for many years. Thanks for that. Why don't we take some maybe brief responses from each of you if you'd like to respond, and then that might give us time for one more quick round. Joe, do you want to start? Or is there anything you'd like to react to, Joe?
Sure. As was mentioned, OGP Local has launched, so that has some, I don't know, well over 100 different members around the world working on that, and hopefully that's a way to reach more local people. There's also, OGP is undergoing its 5-year strategy, which that commenting period is still open for a week, but one of the areas that seems to be emerging from that is trying to figure out how to better help in places where OGP is not, local governments where they're not members of OGP or where they're not. And another area is building, some of the governments like Spain and a few others have been building more national networks that can service dozens and dozens of localities and get closer to people, because that has been an approach that's been working. So we'll be supporting that. I think one of the things the Global Data Barometer and OGP there's a big report called Broken Links that we have on open data against political corruption, which we'll be talking about on Saturday. But one of the findings of that is making sure, that came up in the comment period of that, especially with regard to blockchain, some of these technologies, is in a lot of our countries, the regulations, just a very fundamental issue that I think open government can help with, is getting all the laws and regulations into one place in a lot of these countries about those movements of money and financial flows, because they are often multi-jurisdictional. Some of the lower income countries may not have a law, or the process may be happening outside of their jurisdiction. So straightening that out, and that was a repeated comment, that just getting the law and figuring out what is legal and illegal in that situation might be what's a first step.
Just something briefly only on the blockchain technologies, and it's very loud, no? Sorry. Yes, here? Okay.
For those jet lagging.
That indeed, for instance, blockchain technology offers the promise that you could trace the identity or transactions that are behind whoever uses this, but only when it's public ledger, etc. So one of the recommendations that you will find in the brief when you collect it is that we were suggesting that oversight agencies could just actually assume that every cryptocurrency donation is an anonymous donation, because it would be most likely impossible to trace the origin of that transaction. So that should be already, I mean, we shouldn't wait until the law updates, and it's just simply an anonymous donation. It should be treated as such. In the case of political financing, that could also be an implication of what the point you made.
Thank you so much for your questions, but I will start with what you decided to bring, decentralization, because this is a word I wrote down when you were asking your question. So in my mind, it is only decentralization and vulnerability on the level of individual. And when I'm talking about this human-centric approach, I'm talking about myself. So I have to understand my vulnerabilities. Then, when we are dealing with our neighbors, we have to understand vulnerabilities of our neighbors. Then we are defining these microgroups, we are going to meta groups, we have to understand our vulnerabilities and our vulnerabilities of those with whom we are ready to get into this group. And that's why I think that this is the only solution, not only for problems related to corruption, but to problems related to this holistic approach when we are talking about society. Because in the Baltic countries, we are small countries, and this is the leading idea we are dealing with. So this is holistic approach and all society, total defense approach. And we are learning a lot from Ukrainians, so we are helping with what we can do, but Ukrainians are helping us with this amazing experience. And in one of reports I just mentioned, on the edge of war, we managed to collect with the Baltic Center for Media Excellence, I led this project, in 6 countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, plus Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. We managed to collect information on main media literacy projects. So main audiences, main actors, and main activities. And now we are getting back to our Ukrainian colleagues, and they are sharing that, yes, media literacy network or infrastructure, let's call it infrastructure, works to increase cognitive resilience. Now going to your question. So amazing question and another amazing example. So let's go back to September 2021, National Media Group, for those who know, related to Kovalchuk and related to Alina Kabaeva. Surnames are definitely known for those sitting here in this room. So they had cooperation with Netflix. They were working on localization of Netflix. So Yes, and talking about media, I think it is absolutely relevant to figure out, and here we need the governmental approach, international approach, to figure out how to deal with proxies. So we can define them, so they are proxies, but what we can do with these proxies, as you also mentioned about some MEPs traveling to Crimea or whatever, so what should we do? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Is this working? For Jorg, it was too loud. For me, it's too... But the first part of your question, I think I adopt what Jorg said, but I want to talk about the Belt Road Initiative and its impact on Africa and whether this will compound the corruption situation. First and foremost, and I've argued, China knows what it wants from Africa. Africa does not know what it wants from China. So for Africa, the politicians have a promise to improve on infrastructure development, for instance, in order for them to develop their economies. They're looking to China and the East because in most cases there's no official ODA with China. So some of the conditions around governance, human rights observance will not be raised when they're dealing with China. So China right now is the largest creditor for Africa. 80% of the investment in road sector development is coming from China. And it comes in various forms, whether it is grants or loans, etc. However, the financing also comes as a package. So not only do you get the financing, you get Chinese contractors, and in most cases you get Chinese products, raw materials. What that does is that it circumvents the public procurement laws. So you cannot have a major road infrastructure which is subjected to open tender because the packaging comes with a contractor already identified. In most cases, the contractors are state-owned enterprises. But what it simply does is that over time, the state-owned enterprises register as local companies and they participate in the local market, therefore creating an unfair playing field for the local market. The Chinese companies or the big foreign companies, because it will also include other foreign companies, have access to credit which the local contractors may not have access to. So as we speak, the majority of public infrastructure projects are run by foreign companies. So they literally just take over that market. So there's a lot of collusion as well, which is happening within that sphere. So the challenges are already compounded. The question I've always asked is that if China, for instance, under Xi Jinping is talking about fighting corruption aggressively within China, has that been translated into fighting corruption abroad? The opposite is true. When they find an environment which is already corrupt, they just fit in very well and essentially probably make it even worse. It's not like they bring their values to bear to say, because where we're coming from, we have a very strong anti-corruption crusade. That has not been the case. And I can speak, I've written on this subject, I can speak for a number of African countries where the corruption situation has just become even worse. I'm not saying that they brought it, but they found it, and they've just fitted in hand in glove with what is happening. Thank you.
That is great. And I really appreciate, Rueben, how you lay these things out so clearly. We have time for maybe just one or two more quick questions, and then we do a final round to close. I don't know, Vincent, if you could find some folks with their hands up. I think on the right here. Yeah, we'll start there.
Hi, my question still pertains to Chinese loans, but in the Pacific Island countries, their development, I think, is starting at a lot lower level, and as opposed to South Asia and Africa, I don't think the negative effects of these kinds of loans has been experienced yet. So how do we encourage countries, and it's a pretty democratic region already, but I suppose the transparency is getting worse now. So how do we encourage these places that are kind of taking new Chinese loans to make them more transparent when so far all they're seeing are benefits and they haven't experienced the drawbacks yet?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. I think we had on the left as well.
Thank you for a very fascinating panel. My name is Grigory Mashanov. I work for TI Russia as a lawyer. And my question is about open government. So Russia, as you know, it has attempted to become an OGP member, but later withdrew its application. And actually now the former open government minister of Russia is in jail because of misappropriation of funds and other violations of anti-corruption legislation. So Russia is just another example of an authoritarian country which has failed the open government commitment, although they were not so bad. Some electronic procurement system was good in Russia, but that was a long time ago. But there is example of a country which is not member of OGP, which is not a democracy, which doesn't have free media, and I'm talking about Singapore, which is, one of the top countries in the world if you're speaking about governmental transparency, governance, and so on. So I think my question is more to Joseph. Do you think that Singapore is something unique, incredible in exception, or if democracy is not actually a really obligatory component of the true open government, and one can build a country with true open government without a democracy?
That's a toughie. All right, that'll be good. I can't wait to hear how Joe answers that one, but we'll see if there's one or two more quick questions. No, if not, we'll let our okay, what last one up here then? Sorry, we'll take two more if they're brief. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Helen Taylor from Spotlight on Corruption. I'd love to hear the panel's views on what kind of internal party checks would be helpful for building resilience against foreign covert influence. Just using the UK as an example, political parties have to do very, very little, in fact no checks on on the source of donations. And the independent electoral commission is really, the move there is to sort of defang them rather than strengthen their oversight. So I'd be interested in hearing sort of what the internal checks could look like. Should we be encouraging political parties to have know your donor policies in place? Would that simply be sort of AML checks, or would it be, what would the criteria be? Should it look more broadly, for instance, at whether donors are fit and proper persons? Interested in the panel's views on what criteria we should be looking at there. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thanks, Helen. I will take the last question right here then.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. My name is Matt Mossman. I'm a communications consultant here in DC. Solvita, I had a question for you. I really liked the way you presented your scenario, and to me it really brought home the success that some of those foreign influencers have had in defining heroes and villains and creating narratives and swaying minds. And so I don't mean this in a flippant way, but should there be a Netflix special in which the heroes create a beneficial ownership registry, or produce some sort of other transparency project? And are there examples of that? Any examples of people copying the success of our opponents for good purpose?
That's a great question. Thanks, Matt. I should mention Matt actually helped us do a lot of the background research that went into the debt brief as well. So good to see you here, Matt. Who would like to start? Ruben, do you want to field any of those?
Well, I'll be very brief. The colleagues in the Pacific area, you're lucky you haven't yet had the negative impact, which is great. But I think number one is really to deal with this confidentiality clause provision. I know that Zambia, Sri Lanka are going to be test cases on this G20 common framework, because once China opens up and is able to lift the confidentiality provisions, there will be so many other countries who will ask for that. So that's number one. But it's also just to strengthen debt transparency. I mean, the reporting of debt has to be comprehensive, and the information has to be accessible by different stakeholders. There are not so many countries that do comprehensive and consistent, accurate reporting of debt. But there should also be the involvement of different stakeholders in discussing what the debt is going to be used for. What we've noted in Africa in particular is the propensity to have legacy projects. So for instance, if you come to Lusaka, $356 million was spent on expanding the international airport. I'm an architect by training. There's no way that building can be anywhere near even 200 million. But that gives sufficient padding for corruption. But there's no one who's doing that assessment, and civil society and other professional bodies to really engage at an early stage on these overpriced, overspecified projects. So if there's transparency in the manner that the borrowing process is conducted, that in itself will be an important safeguard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruben. Solvita.
So another example, copy-paste example, how Russia copy-pasted some interesting ideas from China. So I think it was 2007 when in China was a contest, singer-related contest, and they used singers from Taiwan to show this one China policy, one culture, and they promoted the idea of this one country. And in, I think, 2012, the same idea started by Russia, Golos, and I remember Latvian singers also participated and in this idea of creating this, united informational space. And many Latvian media in Latvian also decided to cover this story of success of Latvian singer. So it's also in this idea of soft content. But I think you are absolutely right and correct. So if it works, why not to use it somewhere else? And as a few reminders, so I think media resilience is very important. Media resilience and media transparency. The second is sustainability of these decentralized, very hyper-local projects. So to provide them longitudinal aid and support. And when you are dealing with audiences, it is very important to have these initiatives for longitudinal analysis. When you come back to the same people, to the same audience, to the same place, and when you try to understand who is influencing this audience now, because media consumption is, you know it better than I do, so media consumption is so challenging now with TikTok, other platforms, Weibo, and so on. So I think that maybe talking about my specific profile as media information influence and information manipulations, maybe we should shift from this media-centric approach to the audiences. We have to understand what is going on with audiences and then to figure out who influenced them and how.
Yes, actually, the AML requirements are included in the recommendations we are making. It's interesting how political finance regulations have evolved in two interesting ways. No? On the one hand, it's mostly focused only on political parties and candidates, not on the other actors that are in the periphery of them, no, interacting with them, such as corporations, etc. Corporate political engagement is another area that should perhaps also be reconsidered when we speak about political finance in general, including some of this. But when it comes to what's the minimum we should also request from political parties, it's now more and more, I feel that more often comes to mind that there should be at least some minimal requirements to do some minimal checks, not only the identity of donors or where is this money coming from, or some basic banking for handling their operations, which is most importantly also in countries where there is not enough experience with compliance with political finance regulations. But we understand that in many countries, political parties do not have those capacities. No? So we also think that part of the solution should come with empowering oversight agencies. So they should provide with the systems, reporting, disclosure systems that could be used by the regulated community to file reports, comply with these obligations. When they cannot make these checks on their own, there should be at least some sort of a system of referral system, so they could refer these cases where they see a red flag or something to this oversight agency that may have the capacities to run the information with other agencies or supervisory agencies, etc. But indeed, I think your question raises the point of we should perhaps also think of having these minimal issues or minimal checks also being on the side of political parties, but also other actors in this ecosystem. And another example would be, and I think it's becoming the norm now, since there is a lot of money going through online platforms that sell advertising, more and more those countries that choose to regulate this impose these obligations not just in the political parties that benefit from this or the PR agencies that buy this advertising, but also on the platforms themselves, because they do have the capacities to do these checks or disclose or create the libraries with the information. So I think more responsibility sharing should also come along with the creation of checks or protections against these forms of illicit political financing.
Okay, now it's my job to conclude with the definitive answer to a hundreds-year-long debate. Very quickly, I think I'll quote Tom Carruthers, which is, there are countries that have, of course, developed without these things, but as he says, you could count them on two hands. I think when we look at sustained growth over decades, it's really the democracies that are, the evidence just is building and building that they're working better. Now, how much does open government matter? That's kind of that's a more frontier question. That's open government and civil liberties, I suppose I could say. And here we did a short collaboration with VDEM Institute where they used their Diagonal Accountability Index to look at major human development indicators using their database, which goes back 120 years. And so 3 things they were found, even when you control for electoral democracy and looking at this idea of diagonal accountability, that is free media, civil society, and those things. So for each decade of diagonal accountability, they saw that there was less inequality in the country, lower infant mortality, more growth, and a more adult, for each decade of positive growth in diagonal accountability, they also saw that there was an additional year of adult education. So these are important development outcomes that seem like it's not just elections that matter. It's also having this free and independent civil society and press. And so that's essential. And I think as we come up on 2026, it will be the 250th anniversary of the first Freedom of Information Law in Sweden. But it actually wasn't called a Freedom of Information Law. It was called the Media Freedom Law. And I think it's important to remember that those two things were originally paired together and that we need to keep those things paired together as we look at countering these illiberal influences. It's not just the transparency, it's also making sure that the people who use it are empowered.
Thanks so much for that. Joe, I'm just going to close with a couple of final words. There's so much to say. These are such big topics. We've seen that there are varied tactics and patterns of influence. We didn't talk about it too much, but they're clearly interrelated because sometimes, for instance, information manipulation can be used to promote an extractive deal or an opaque loan, or it could be used to promote a political party, or political party finance is used to support a candidate who's going to push forward a shady economic deal. So they're also very interrelated, which I think is important to keep in mind. We've talked about some potential transparency and oversight measures. There are more in the briefs that have been referenced. I think it's clear that these are challenges that require responses at all levels, local level as well as national level, and across all different types of stakeholders, and with more citizen ownership and citizen awareness as well. Joe's points on safeguards, I think, are really important. We can't go too far and end up with remedies that are worse than the disease, in the sense that going too far on political finance control or on addressing information manipulation could end up damaging some key freedoms in terms of media and information and political participation. So these are huge issues. I know in NDI, if anybody's interested in continuing to talk about them more, we're available. I know our partners at OGP and TI feel the same. I'm very grateful to our panelists. I'm really grateful to the audience. If we could give like a stamina award, there are 11 hours since we started this morning at 8:30, and you're still here. I'm so impressed. So I'd like just one final big round of applause for all of you and for our panelists for this excellent discussion.